Hello. So I'd like you to meet Lien, who is the woman on the cover of my book and a person I met for the first time on the 21st of December 2014, which is when I took this photograph of her. And I met this woman who was fantastically well-adjusted and kind, who was interested in modern art, who had a season ticket to the Amsterdam Opera, and with whom I felt an instant connection. But at the same time, I knew that she was someone who'd grown up with my own father as a sister, but whom I had never met. I'd always known that my grandparents had hidden Jewish children during the war, and I knew that there was one who had actually stayed with them afterwards. But beyond that, I knew very little. I knew that there'd been a family row sometime in the 1980s. I remember my mother crying about that. But beyond that, there was almost nothing that I knew about what had happened to this girl who I knew was called Lien. And something very strange happened to me in November 2014 when my eldest uncle, Case, died. I realized that there was a generation that was dying and that their stories were going to be lost if I didn't do something now. And I think at the same time I was newly conscious that anti-Semitism, which had felt like something distant and historical and of the war, was important again, and that there were, again, people talking very skeptically about whether democracy was worth having. And I think those things, though they were never totally clear to me, were part of the reason that I asked my mother about Lien, because I knew that she still had some kind of contact details. And the result was this meeting where I met a person who, when the lift opened in an Amsterdam apartment, asked me to stand still for a moment, and she said, "Let me look at you." And then she said, "You look more like your mother." And we had this meeting, and she said, "Well, why have you come here? What motivates you to write this book?" Which I'd vaguely said in an email. And I said I didn't really know. And she said, "Well, without families, you don't have stories. I don't really have a story. Why don't we sit down and tell me what you think you could do?" And she started asking me questions about my academic work and my opinions on the world. And after about half an hour, she said, "Yes, I've got confidence in this. Should we sit down at the table that we see there? If you brought a notebook and pen." And this astonishing thing happened where this woman who I barely knew suddenly became a relation. And we started a series of interviews that ended up stretching for 40 hours in all of taped material around which I built the book. And Lien herself had thought very little about her story. And it was only gradually as we started talking, first of all on that day in December, that she remembered she had various documents around the flat, some of which she took a while to search for. And one of the things she handed me was this letter, which I still find a very difficult document to look at. This is the letter that Lien's parents wrote in August 1942, not knowing to whom it would be sent, but addressing an unknown man and woman as the father and mother of her only child. She tells us that her daughter has been taken away from her by circumstance and asks whether these people will, with the best will and wisdom, look after her. She also says that she hopes in the moments of sadness that will come to Lien, that she will think only of that man and woman as her mother and father, and that they will comfort her as such. And that's the letter that was sent to my grandparents in 1942. When Lien was picked up at the door by a member of the Dutch resistance, taken to a completely different town and given a new identity. And I saw that letter for the first time in 2014. But I also saw a second letter, which is a letter written in 1988, in which my grandmother wrote in enormous anger to Lien. She actually put the postage stamps on upside down in the letter. And she wrote that she never wanted to see her again and never to call her again. And they never spoke, even the rest of my grandmother's life, which went on for 7 years after that. So I think very early on for me, the challenge of this book was to think how things could have gone from that first letter to the second letter And in addition to that, how this girl who'd been cut out of her family in 1942 could have turned into this warm, artistic, vibrant person who I now met for the first time and who in many ways I immediately felt was an auntie of mine, somebody with whom I felt entirely at ease. And she gave me this astonishing privilege of following her life from her earliest memories. She was very decisive, and she said, well, you can ask me anything you want. And very quickly, we sat down at that table in Amsterdam, and I started asking her questions about everything she remembered, from what her bedroom was like, to what she ate, to what she remembered of her parents, all the way up to where she is now, aged 82 at the moment. I met her, and now still a very good friend of mine, aged 85. So these documents included incredibly moving things like this photograph of Lien's entire family on the beach in Scheveningen, just outside The Hague. It was a large, warm family. If you see here the woman in the center carrying a volleyball, immediately to her left are Lien's father and mother. And of this picture, everyone except Aunt Rosa, who's the one carrying the volleyball, died in Auschwitz. And Aunt Rosa survived Auschwitz, but only through being experimented on for her period of incarceration there. So I was presented with that stark fact, which shockingly actually corresponds to something I was not aware of, which is that the survival rate amongst Jews in the Netherlands was 2 times worse than that of any other Western country. 80% of Dutch Jews died in the Holocaust. And even more shockingly, it was actually the Dutch police and the Dutch railway and the Dutch civil service who administered that act, who organized the virtual eradication of their substantial Jewish population of 150,000 people between 1942 and March 1943, when the Netherlands was declared Jew-free. So I was confronted with those astonishing facts as somebody who'd kind of been brought up with a myth of Dutch national resistance. I was also confronted with this book, which Lien had forgotten she had, and we ended up looking up I went and stood on a chair and found it in her bookshelf, which is a poesie album. Almost all Dutch schoolgirls used to have these. They're little books where you ask people to write poems. And the first page of the poesie album is written by her father in September 1940. And she writes this very he doesn't know it's moving. It's a poem about how he hopes that she'll never have reason to have tears. And in the end, this little page ended up giving me the metaphor for the book, because opposite this picture of a father doing something very intimate and personal with his daughter, we have these 2 cut-out girls who can be taken from one sheet and pasted onto another, which is what happened to Lien in 1942, and ended up, in fact, happening again and again as she was chased from one position to the next by that Dutch police force. So this poem book gave these astonishing personal moments of recollection. This is the poem By My Uncle Case, the one who sparked my writing the book, written only, a month after Lien arrived with my grandparents in the town of Dordrecht. He's just addressing her as his cousin, which is what she was supposed to be after she got this new identity. And there are these unintentionally harrowing documents. This is a book that Lien's mother was still able to send her through the secret post that was used by the resistance, which tries to carry on the fiction that she's gone there to have a happy holiday. The book is called About a Happy Holiday. And the moment when Lien received that book and the letter that her mother and her father were still able to send her, it suddenly dawned on her that this wasn't a happy holiday, that she was not going to be able to contact them again. And very powerfully, soon after she was told she couldn't write for her father's birthday in November, she took off the 2 rings that she'd been given by her parents and rolled them under the floorboards of the house in Dordrecht. And she said she wasn't able to think about them at all for basically about 30 years after that. So Lien's story is a personal one and also a wider one about what happened in the Netherlands. So she was born in The Hague to an entirely assimilated family who barely thought of themselves as Jewish in a society that was actually remarkably anti-Semitic, a society where Jews had always had more rights than anywhere else in Europe. Then, in 1942, she was sent to this town of Dordrecht, where my grandparents, a sort of working-class couple, very active in the union movement, lived. And then when there was a police raid on that house in March 1943, she ended up being brought ultimately to a farmhouse opposite Rotterdam, where she hid in darkness for 9 months. Before that, too, was spotted by the police, and yet again she escaped. And bizarrely, and for me, quite shockingly, ended up in the village in the Netherlands, the one village in the Netherlands that I know very well, having come from there originally, my mother's tiny home village of Bennekom, where she was given, again, a new identity. So the way I wrote the book was to go to all these places, often actually going to the houses or the places where she was hidden, and then talking to the people who were there, who brought their own stories, sometimes stories of how they were now an oppressed immigrant group who worried about what the Dutch state might do to them, or in the case of Bennekom, a place where, unbeknownst to my grandparents and my mother's family who'd lived there all their lives, there was in fact a vast network of Jewish hideaways, 150 Jewish people hidden in this tiny village, virtually all of whom survived, and about whom nothing had been spoken and nothing recorded, astonishingly. The Dutch had sort of effectively eviscerated this past and had gone through this act of collective amnesia. So I did all this really fundamentally in January 2015, where I did this pattern of interviewing Lien and then going to these places, which felt like initially like they didn't have any history at all, because the Netherlands looked so modern and so efficient with fantastic trains and fantastic social services, and yet was sort of hiding this past. And in the end, I thought, I want to record something of this strange palimpsestic experience I've had, where I'm seeing this modern country with its current racial tensions and its current elements of extremist politics alongside all its efficiency, at the same time as this incredible story of somebody's individual life, and also my own story of coming to terms with what happened in my family, and that made me think anew about my own relationship with my children. So the book has ended up being a kind of dialogue between three voices. One voice is Lien's, effectively, a kind of free and direct speech where I imagine myself into her experiences at every stage, sections of the book that she closely read herself so that they corresponded with her memories. Secondly, there's a kind of third-person figure who gives a historical account of what actually happened in the Netherlands, what the Netherlands' history is. And then finally, there's my story of going into archives, for example, the police archives in The Hague, or of visiting places where Lien had lived and meeting people who are there now. And ultimately, it's a story, I hope, that is uplifting, because it does take us to that Amsterdam apartment where I met Lien in 2014, and how she could, after all this suffering, including her ultimate break with my grandparents and with my family, how she could have ended up being this humane and wonderful friend who I'm very pleased was there with me at the Costa ceremony, and who will again be visiting Oxford in a month or two's time. So the book tries to basically combine these resources, the resources of the novel and the resources of a kind of documentary history. So there is Lien's father's piece in the Pussy album next to a picture of her parents as part of a sports club in The Hague in the 1920s. There's Lien with her cousins and her mother in an early snap. And then here are my aunt and uncle, Kees and Ali. And remarkably, I think the book has ended up sort of telling a story that feels personal to a lot of people. Partly, a lot of people have been writing to me to say they have these kind of war stories. But I think there are also a lot of families where somebody isn't spoken to anymore, where somebody feels cut out, feels that their emotions haven't been fully validated. And I think Lien is very happy that her story is now being read very widely. The book's now out in 11 languages. And you know, she is pleased that it's not just a victim story. It's a story about how something terrible could have happened, but also how we can come to terms with something like that and apply some of those lessons of history to a moment now that I think feels more desperately in need of reminding of where we were during that period of 1939 to 1945. Thank you very much.